DM's a development manager for, as far as I know,
Ooh.
and PM is a project manager.
Well, what's the difference? What's the difference between a PM that DMs?
Yeah, I mean, they are to a certain extent interchangeable. You could argue that the project manager specifically is involved in the build process, whereas the development manager could be involved in things like acquisition, getting the DA approved, getting finance even. So they're throughout the process, where my understanding is that the PM is probably more involved in just the build process itself.
And you would typically have a larger project to be able to, like, it would be a larger project that would need someone to just a PM, and then you're not going to have both. You're going to, if you're just starting out and you're doing a retain and build, or 1 into 3 or 1 into 5, you're not going to have that many people.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the developers that I know are 1 or 2 man bands, right? They go out and they do everything. And there are successful guys who are running, 15, 20 projects all at once, and it's just 1 or 2 people. And there are guys who are happily have a full-time or a part-time job and doing property development part-time as well. So you've really got to find the balance of what works for you. And there's no, I guess, magical formula. It's what works for you and what sort of projects you want to be doing, I guess.
Can I ask a question about how you learned or how you decided on what the demographics or demographic was in your area?
Yeah, so couple of things. I mean, I went out to Adelaide, checked it out, as simple as that sounds, right? Walked the suburb. I did.
Would you say boots on the ground?
Boots on the ground. Absolutely.
You can't do it from a desk, can you, Joe? I mean, you have to visit an area. You have to smell the fish and chips and maybe
smell the fish and chips. I feel like you don't. Sorry, go on, Dan.
Put that on a TikTok.
Inside joke. Someone buy me a shirt that says boots on the ground.
So boots on the ground and seeing the place, speaking to real estate agents in the area who've sold similar projects. Just say, look, who's purchased them? Who are the buyers out there paying money for this sort of thing? And then just getting some very basic, ABS data. Just go, well, in the last census, what does the typical family look like? What sort of housing do they live in? Is it detached? Is it units? How many people rent in the area? How many people buy in the area? And what sort of houses do they currently live in? And what sort of properties do they actually want to live in? And if you create something that people want and ultimately want to move into, then you're probably halfway to doing a good development, I think. Let's dive straight into it. So market data. So we look at things like values by type, square meterage by type. So is what they're building typical of, say, a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-garage dwelling that in that suburb? Are we pitching too much at the higher end, or are we going too low market for the area? Making sure there's enough transaction volume. Is there enough 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-car properties that are selling, that are new? If there's 3 per year, that's you're kind of almost pioneering. If there's 30, if there's 300, then you probably consider the other side, right? Is there too much competition in the area? So whilst there's no magic formula, it's really important that you consider this sort of supply and transactional volume, and then comparables. What are they selling for? How much are they getting? What have they done wrong on a particular project to have gotten a penalty on their price? What do they do right to get way above what the average development sells for? So that's the market data. The next one is third-party references. So delving into that a little bit further, we look at things like land titles, council overlays, Department of Transport. If it's in an area where there's state roads, for example, we look at sales volumes and sales data again. We even talk to real estate agents who have sold property in the area just to get their gauge of what they think of a development. And if they were to sell one, would it be easy to sell? Would it be difficult to sell? What would they recommend the floor plans to be? Valuation and validation. So this is where we get third parties involved. So if you submit a project to Crowd Property, one of the things that we do once we've reviewed it is actually to do a third party independent valuation. So that's a qualified valuer doing a commercial valuation. So when you purchase a normal investment property, land with a house on it, it would take 2 days to get a turnaround on that valuation.
Yeah,
that's doing what they call an as-is valuation. So the land and house exactly as is today. So, but when you do a commercial valuation, what that involves is much more detail. So one of the things they do is what they call an as-if complete valuation. So with the specifications that you've submitted, with the approvals, and with the level of finishes, if that was built today, what would that market value be? So you can see there's a bit of prediction here, right? Like the valuer has to, based on your drawings, figure out what today's value is. And that's why it takes a long time. So it could be, as quick as a couple of weeks. It could be as long as a month for them to do that valuation. And that valuation provides some insight as to what the valuer is worried about on that particular, what the risks are. So that's good feedback for us assessing the deal. That's also good feedback for the developer getting into the deal to know that a third party has looked at it independently and has reviewed the project as well.
So that's pretty much the process, right? Market data, third party references, so getting checks by other people, valuation and validation, and the borrower, project information.
Yeah, so borrower. So we find out about the borrower themselves, why they want to do this development, their costings to make sure that they've got all their T's crossed and I's dotted. That's something we also look at. But if you're a developer, also ask yourself, are you doing this to hold? Are you doing this to sell? Make sure you've got a clear path to that and stick with it, whether things are going well or not. On the right-hand side, we've got in-house expertise. So within Crowd Property, it says 100, but we've probably got a wider expertise now. We've probably got about 150 years of property development experience in-house. And I would say that once we do the project, it's learning by doing, and we're always learning ourselves on new things. There's things that none of us have seen, but we've also realized that everyone's learning on their process. So it pays to have that expertise on the team to maybe provide some early advice on deals and maybe anticipate some issues that you may not have foreseen.
So in terms of when you talked, because I think this is one of the parts that people potentially underestimate, particularly if you're going to sell exit strategy consultation. Typically, how many exit strategies would you like to see in a project, or how many do you do in yours? Do you like to have 3 or 4, or is one enough depending on the project?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 main ones, right? You either sell it or you keep it, right? Like that's
one consultation or 2.
And look, all jokes aside, be very clear when you're doing a project what you're intending to do, because it affects things like structuring. Like if you're going to keep both of them, do you really want to subdivide? And again, this is not advice, right? But these are some of the things you should be considering. Like, do you really want to subdivide and pay 2 sets of land tax and pay 2 sets of council fees, et cetera, et cetera? Or if you're going to sell, well, you better make sure it's subdivided, because you can only if you have 2 that's not subdivided, then you can only sell it as 1, and that'll dramatically decrease your the value on the back end. So it's really important. And the other thing is, if you're holding it, are you able to refinance it with a bank, for example, to hold it for that that 20 to 30 year term? So they're just some of the considerations and some of the things that we actually ask developers when they come in for funding.
Yeah. So tell us what is about what is it about a capital stack, and why is it important for your development?
Yeah, very good question. Look, every single financier that's been on a podcast or a presentation butchers the capital stack, right? They put up this pyramid, and you've got your equity at the common equity at the top and the senior debt down the bottom, right? It's important to know two perspectives. One is if you're doing property development, there are many ways to skin a cat. So you require $1 million in funding for a project. You can get that through by getting common equity. You can get that by getting preferred equity. You can get that through mezz debt. You can do that through senior debt. As you progress down, the lower the risk, the lower the return. So senior debt is generally the cheapest, which is the area that we play in. The common equity is the highest risk and highest return because that's put at risk first. So from the
let's bring this intro up so it makes sense. Yeah. And can you explain what the heck common equity? Now, I just know equity. I know when I buy a thing and it goes to 200 grand, $1,000 increase, that's my equity. What is common equity, preferred equity, mezzanine debt, and senior debt? Give us a run through.
Yeah, absolutely. So common equity is typically where the developer sits, right? So that's the riskiest amount of equity or money you put into the deal. And the reason why it's the riskiest is because it's the first money to go into a deal, and really the last, before all of the others get paid, before the preferred equity, the mezz debts. So if from the investor's perspective, if you're investing in common equity, you want a really high return for that because that's probably the riskiest on that scale. Conversely, if you're investing into senior debt, the return's not as high, but you've got a very good chance of getting your money back along with interest payments as well, right? Because you're into the deal last when everyone else has put their money in, and you also, once the property is sold or refinanced, you get your money out first. So the chances of getting that back is really, really high.
So what are some examples of senior? Last in, first out.
Last in, first out. What are some examples of senior debt? Like, who is the typical senior debtor?
The banks.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. There's a reason why the banks play in that space, because it is safe. It's usually quite a chunky part of the capital stack. And there's a pretty good chance that they get their money back on that because of the loan to value ratios. I'm going to use another term here. If you're gearing at appropriate LVRs, then there's a good chance you'll get that money back.
Yeah. Okay. So the banks are taking that risk. Does every single deal have these 4 types of debt in them? Or
no, not necessarily. Capital? So let's take a simple property purchase, right? 3-bedroom house. It's $1 million. The bank will lend you 80% of that as senior debt down the bottom, and you're putting in 20% for the deposit, 5% for closing costs, and that's common equity. I mean, that's probably the most common way that a deal is structured. But you can get more creative than that. You can issue things like preferred equity, where it's not quite the last out; it's out before the common equity. So there's essentially less risk compared to common equity. You can also staple it to a coupon, for example, where it pays an annual rate. And then there's mezzanine debt. So it's debt like you're borrowing, but it's at a mezzanine level, so just above the senior and just after the preferred equity. So it's called mezzanine because it's kind of bridging the gap between the equity and the debt space. And then
do people deliberately get mezzanine debt, or is it one of these things that just you accidentally go over 100 grand and you need money right now, so you have to pay that extra? You have to pay that extra capital, or do people deliberately go out there to get mezzanine finance as a part of their, they're part of the deal?
Yeah, no, I mean, like as a developer, you try and avoid, but if you need to get the deal over the line to finish up the last, finishings and bits and pieces, that's what you need to do.
Yeah,
right?
your deal's a perfect example of this, right? We're going through COVID. You think you're going to have a 20% return in a simple 1:3 subdivision, and then all of a sudden COVID hits, and then timeframes blow out by, I don't know, 6 months, 12 months. You're not going to have, if you are floating by as if this is your first 1:3, you're not going to have $100,000 to just sit there. But you're going to get the money. It's going to happen. You're going to get this 30% return, but someone needs to give the builder his paycheck and pay the Sparky and pay everybody. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly right. So on the whole scheme of things, if you're making 30+% on a development and you're paying a couple of percentage points on mezzanine debt, well, you do it any day of the week to get the deal across the line, and that's sometimes what it takes. It's one of those things where you may not want to use, but sometimes you just need to use it. For example.
Yeah, it's one of those things like embrace it when you have to, avoid it if you can, right? Like if you got to use it, LMI. You got to use it. Yeah, yeah, exactly like LMI.
What are some of the key things that a lot of people tend to overlook with property developments?
Yeah, that's a very good one. What are the common pitfalls of developments, right? I mean, there's quite a few, but some of the most common ones that are over easily looked are just, I mean, we've talked about this, product market fit, right? Make sure what you're building, before you worry about the finishes, before you worry about the design, be in the shoes of your end customer. So the classic, Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind, right? And this is perfect for property development. Make sure you've got a picture of what it looks like at the end and slowly work towards that. A lot of people go, okay, well, my next step is to get planning approval. My next step is then to tender out for the build. My next step is then to subdivide, quickly losing sight of what the product looks like at the back end. The second thing is probably finance. Like that gets very overlooked, and probably like
it adds so much expense if you're not doing it correctly. It's like a percentage point is thousands of dollars, so don't mess that up.
Exactly.
Sorry,
we encourage people to it's exactly the point. We encourage people to talk to us early, even before they've secured the deal, and say, hey, look, Daniel and the team, what do you think of this development? Have you seen this before? And if it's a good deal, we'll tell you. There's no charge to do that. If it's a crap deal, we'll tell you too, right? So it avoids the developer putting hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to make less money. We want to see developers succeed, and we want investors who invest on our platform to get their money and interest back as well, so they can go again for the next project.